What's up everybody? My name is Lian. Welcome to Ahnestly. The first PC I ever built was a small form factor PC, and today we're gonna be jamming a ton of power into a tiny case like this. And I'm gonna assume that you know nothing about PC, so this is gonna be a step-by-step tutorial on how to build a PC. I'll leave timestamps down below in case you wanna skip all that. The great thing about this guide is that even if you're not using my exact case, many small form factor PCs use this layout with the motherboard and the power supply on one side and the graphics card on the other. Now, if you want to build in the Cooler Master NR200, which is a small form factor case, but it's a bigger case than this, pretty significantly bigger than this, I actually did a full build guide on that case as well, which you can find right here. First, we'll start with the critical and optional accessories you want to have on hand for your PC build. Then we'll talk about the components I chose and why. Then we'll get to the actual build and the build tutorial. And then finally, we'll finish with benchmarks. Links to everything you see here will be in the description below, and timestamps are there for you to be able to jump around. I busted my knee, so I don't have the strength to drag a desk over, so I'm gonna be building on my ottoman of my replica Eames chair. This material isn't conductive, so it should be okay. Critical accessories. The first thing you're probably gonna want is an aftermarket thermal grease. This here is one of the best in the business, Thermal Grizzly Cryonaut. This thermal grease is gonna go between your processor and your CPU cooler, whatever you decide to choose, and it's gonna lower your temperatures by like 1 to 2 degrees Celsius, which doesn't seem like much, but in a tiny form factor case like this, every degree is going to count. Next is gonna be your screwdrivers. Now, normally, in any other case, you could use whatever screwdrivers and you should be fine. However, in a small form factor case, the crevices are tiny, the amount of space you have is tiny, so you're not gonna be able to put your hand in there and lower a screw into the screw hole before you screw it in. So you're gonna want something with a magnetic tip to be able to lower that screw for you. And here's the thing, if you lose a screw inside of your small form factor case while you're working on it, there are a million crevices that screw can fall into, and it may mean that you have to unscrew all your components to find that screw. So save yourself the trouble, get yourself a magnetic screwdriver set. I used to have a cheap one from, I forget, like Micro Center or something, and then the screw head started to shave after a little bit, and I was like, forget it, and I bought the iFixit set, and I haven't looked back since. Next, you're gonna need your operating system. I'm gonna be installing Windows 11. I don't really want to do Windows 11, but I'm kind of forced into it by my components. Regardless, you're gonna wanna grab an 8 GB, a really cheap 8 GB thumb drive, then Google how to create a bootable drive for whatever operating system you want. Click obviously the main source. In the case of Windows, you want to go to the windows.com source, and it'll give you the tutorial on how to do it. It's super easy to do. And in addition, if you do not plan to hardwire your computer into the Ethernet and your motherboard is capable of Wi-Fi, then you're going to want to drive the wireless driver for your motherboard. This is not a PC you bought off the shelf. This will have no drivers on it. So if your computer is capable of wireless or Wi-Fi, you cannot use the Wi-Fi unless you have the driver. So the way to do this is you type in your motherboard's model and then the word support. And then you go to the manufacturer's webpage, go to the support page, go to drivers, and you should be able to find the wireless driver for that motherboard. Again, if you do not do this, you will not be able to connect to the internet once you install. Final critical accessory is going to be some kind of dedicated light source, a flashlight or something. I'm a YouTuber, so I have these kind of, it's red. I have this and I'm gonna be shining this. The reason why is because all the components are gonna create massive shadows inside of your case, and with there being so little room, you're gonna have a really hard time seeing things and labels on your motherboard once it's in there. So you're gonna want to get like a headlamp or something to be able to shine a light so you can see. Optional accessories are going to be zip ties. You can use this to manage your cables for a very clean look. But more importantly, you can use this to get the cables out of the way of things like fans. In a small form factor case, your cables will really be everywhere, and there's a good chance it may run into a fan, preventing that fan from spinning. So this is a good way to kind of yank it and pull it out of the way. In my case, I'm not very good at cable management, and so this is going to be more so that I can keep the cables out of the way of the fans, out of the way of the airflow, so that I can have the most ideal temperatures inside the case. The next optional accessory is going to be isopropyl alcohol with cotton swabs, or what is this? Ear swabs, whatever, Q-tips, that's what they are. This is gonna be the best way to get that thermal grease, which I showed you guys earlier. This thermal grease off of existing components, like if you decide to go aftermarket and you use an all-in-one liquid cooler, that's going to have thermal grease already installed on it. And so you're gonna need alcohol and these swabs to wipe that off. Or if you make a mistake, like let's say you seat your cooler and then you realize, crap, I did it backwards. Well, you probably want to get that thermal grease off, because at that point you may create air pockets and things like that. So you're gonna want this to be able to clean off that the thermal grease off of the components. This actually might move into a critical accessory, so you really might want to just have this on hand just in case you don't need to round it to the store in the middle of building. For the PC components, I'm going to start actually with my hard drive, which sounds like a really weird place to start, but this will actually impact your build most significantly because there are drives called SATAs, which are larger rectangular format drives. And in order to use that in your PC, you're gonna need 2 additional cables, which is gonna take up a lot of space in your already tiny limited space PC. So using something like this is called an M.2. This format is at M.2. This is an NVMe generation 4.0. If you don't need crazy read and write speeds, you can get Gen 3.0, and it's about the same price as the larger rectangular M.2 SATA drives. Anyways, the reason why I recommend getting something like this instead of the bigger rectangle is because this plugs directly into your motherboard, and that's it. You don't need any other cables, you don't need anything else, so I highly recommend you go with an M.2 format hard drive. Next up is the case. This is the Lian Dan A4 H20. Huge shout out to Lian Li for sending this over. I think this thing is super high quality. I love how tiny this thing is. And Lian Li also sent over their brand new SP750 SFX power supply in white. And so this is going to be the power supply I'm going to be putting in this case. Processor is going to be Intel's 12th Gen i9-12900K, and paired with that is the MSI Meg Unify Z690 ITX motherboard. That's a huge mouthful, but the reason why I'm going with Z690 for this is because this, first of all, has 2 USB-C ports in the back, Thunderbolt 4 ports, which I need because the case only offers 1. And in addition to that, it's because I plan to overclock a little bit, or to see if the computer won't melt first, because this is a very, very hot processor. So if I have any thermal headroom, I do plan on overclocking a little bit, and all of the other motherboards that support Intel's 12th Gen do not allow for overclocking. I mentioned earlier that I'm going to be installing Windows 11 begrudgingly on this machine, and that's because the 12th generation Intel processors use P cores and E cores, and Windows 11 is able to kind of manage those P cores and E cores much better than Windows 10. This is going to be a video editing rig, so I've got 2 sticks of 32 gigabytes each of the Kingston Fury Beast RAM for a total of 64 gigabytes. In a small form factor PC, you can only have a maximum of 2 RAM sticks and a maximum of 64 gigabytes, so I'm hitting the maximum here. The CPU cooler is going to be the ML240 Illusion White Edition. Cooler Master sent this over, so huge shout out, but I am worried that this won't fit inside the case. Well, it will fit, but I won't be able to close that side panel because the case has a maximum size of 55 millimeters, and this cooler is 57, the pump is 57 millimeters. Now, I'm going to be okay with that because I don't mind keeping that side panel off for better cooling. However, for you, if you want to go with an all-in-one liquid cooler, in this case, make sure it's 55 millimeters or less. Last but not least, my graphics card of choice is my trusty Asus Strix 3090. I love that I'm going to be able to shove this giant graphics card into that tiny little PC. Let's get building. When building a PC, best practice is that you should breadboard your PC first, which means you basically build the PC outside of the computer to confirm everything works before you shove it into a tiny case like this. I highly recommend you do it if it's your first time. I'm not gonna do it, and we're just gonna go straight in. Do as I say, not as I do. Yeah. To install the CPU, we're gonna go ahead and lift up this metal tab here, and this black plastic piece is going to stay on. It'll pop off on its own. Notice that there is a little arrow on the bottom left. What you're gonna do is you're gonna take your processor, you're gonna find that same bottom arrow on your processor, so it's located here. You'll lift this thing up here like this, and you wanna line up, again, those arrows and make sure that the arrow is on the bottom or wherever that location is on the black plastic. You're gonna gently, very gently lower this on into the corners. Then what I like to do is gently drop it like that, and then just do a little wiggle just to make sure it's firmly seated. There are pins there that are very sensitive, so you don't want to be jamming things or dropping things from high heights. They're very sensitive pins. Then you're gonna lower this piece, you're gonna put a little bit of pressure on it, and then make sure this little tab here, those teeth, are gonna catch under it, and then that black plastic piece should fall off, and you're gonna rehook it, and this black plastic piece should just be able to get thrown away. Next up is the hard drive. You need to look up your motherboard's manual to see where your hard drive needs to go. Again, I'm using an M.2 drive, so I'm gonna be unscrewing this right here. You see here, there is a plastic shield, a plastic wrap right here. This right here is called a thermal pad. That's gonna give cooling to your hard drive. So you wanna make sure that this is removed. Otherwise, you're gonna get really terrible cooling on your hard drive because of this plastic here. So make sure you remove that just like this. My hard drive is a little unique in that it already came with the heat shield, so I'm actually going to not reinstall this on, and I'm just gonna install this on, and that's it. So the way you do this is this M.2 drives, these NVMe drives have a little set of chips and then a big set of chips. Make sure you line it up on the slot. There's a big divot here. So I'm gonna make sure you install it at a slight angle, just like that, push it in and then lower it down. And this, you see, is gonna flop up and down. What you need is you need a screw from your motherboard that's gonna screw this and hold it down. It's gonna look something like this. You can see these tiny little screws and it might be labeled M.2 screw. I'm gonna screw it in just like that. 99% of the time, you're gonna wanna install your RAM right now, but I'm gonna put that on hold because I know I'm gonna have good visibility of these RAM slots when I install this into the motherboard, but not installing the RAM right now does two things. One, I have a little bit more room to put my cooler on, and two is that I'm gonna route cables down this way, so by not putting the RAM on right now, I can do exactly what I wanna do and then install the RAM a little bit later. You see, I've got a little bit space down here, so for thin cables, I can route that there. If the RAM sticks were there, I would have a little harder time routing them down and through there. The PC case has 2 thumb screws in the back, or 4 thumb screws, 2 that lock in at the top here. And then you can just use your fingernails to pop this open just like that. I'm gonna go ahead and remove that panel. Do the same thing with the other side. I've got the thumb screws here, just like that. And then I've got this thing of cables here. Right now, I'm not gonna bother with that. What I wanna do is I wanna go ahead and pop off this top panel, which again, you just pull off. There's no screws for this one. And then you're gonna need to uninstall this. You're gonna need to pull that out. And then you're also going to need to uninstall, well, you can optionally uninstall this bottom piece so that you have better access to the motherboard down below. So I am going to remove this piece as well. The good thing about this case is that all of these little screws here are exactly the same. So you don't need to organize the screws so that you find the right ones later. I forgot to mention, you also want to pop out the front panel as well, because you're gonna need this giant hole here to route your graphics cards through. Next, you're gonna wanna uninstall this here. This is going to be where your power supply goes, and you're gonna need to install your power supply to this cage before inserting it back in. Again, these screws are the exact same size as all the other screws on the case. I've always found the CPU cooler to be the most overwhelming part of any build, because just look at all of these things that come in here. I've already pulled out 2 things. It's okay, take a deep breath. We'll take it one step at a time. There's a manual. I highly recommend you read this thing. The way you read it is there's a whole bunch of crap in here, but you're gonna wanna find your motherboard socket version. So I'm using the 12th gen Intel processors, which is LGA 1700. So you see it says Intel, LGA, and it's got all these models, and so 1700 is here. It's gonna tell me that I need to find these 2 metal brackets. You have to find these 2 metal brackets, and I have to install them onto the side here, so that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Next, if I look LGA 1700, I'm gonna need to find this black plastic piece and install it behind the motherboard. This is the motherboard here, and then unscrew these little things. I can refer to the shape G over here on that page. Here you can see it says Cooler Master 1700, so this is the piece that I need. Let me grab my motherboard. Okay, so I'm not gonna install the pump just yet. I just wanted to get that ready because we are getting into pump territory. I'm gonna move this slightly out of the way for now, or sorry, I meant the motherboard out of the way for now. And I'm gonna go ahead and install the fans onto the radiator. Now for this build, the radiator is gonna sit on top of the build, and I want it to be pulling air down through it with the radiator sitting on top. So what you wanna do is, technically these fans should have an arrow direction. It should show you arrows for how the airflow works, but this doesn't have it on there. So what you can do is, you can see the rotation or the orientation of the fins, it's gonna spin this way. So what you can do is you can spin it and put your hands at either side and see where the majority of the air is flowing. So this clearly is pushing air down this way. So I want it to pull down air, so this is going to fit just like that on here. Now, in order to install these fans onto the radiator, you're gonna need to find the giant long screws to go down through the hole on the fan and up into that hole on the radiator. Something you want to be mindful of is where you want this fan cable to go, because this fan cable has to plug into something. So you want to be able to orient it in a way that you can either hide the cables or do whatever you need to with this. I'm actually going to reseat this so that the cable is sitting more on the left side here. I have some concern here because these screws are protruding. They're pretty thick screws. And if you look at the case and the way it lowers on, this is going to lower in this way. But you can see that these metal protrusions, I'm worried that it's gonna run into this. So I might have to do something to I might have to get rid of 1 or 2 of these screws so that it fits in okay here. Also, something to note is that these are RGB fans, and so they have these little headers here that are supposed to plug into a controller. that allows you to be able to use their RGB features, but I want this computer to be RGB-less. So I'm actually not going to use this part and just use the standard fan headers here and plug them into an extension, which I'll talk about when I get to it. Next, I'm gonna screw this part into here so that it holds it onto this black piece. You'll find the screws that drill into from these two pieces inside of the giant baggie that came with your all-in-one cooler. Next, I'll go ahead and lower this cooler and the pump through this big hole here, along with all the cables. Yeah, see, I'm a little bit worried. You see how there's play here? I think that a lot of that has to do with the fact that these screws are so gigantic on the bottom. So what I did was I took off one screw from each of the corners. I took off one screw from here and one screw from here, and for some reason it sits better this way. As you can see, not nearly as much play here. I'm not gonna screw this black piece on just in case I need to reroute some of these cables, like these fan cables here, because it's very possible that it might be better off if I route it down here somewhere. At this point, I'm gonna put the motherboard in, but first let me go ahead and unzip tie these case cables. The screws to put the motherboard in the case actually come with the case. They look like screws that have flying saucer tops. So some of these are power supply screws. So thick neck, thick double neck, this is a power supply screw versus a rounded double neck. This is the motherboard screw. Motherboard screw, power supply screw. This is why magnetic screws are so easy or so convenient, because up here in the top left corner, you can't really get your finger in there. So it's really nice to be able to gently navigate it in. I'm gonna start plugging these cables into my motherboard as well as the power cables into the motherboard, because once things are connected, it's gonna be really hard to kind of route cables in here. Plus it'll give me an understanding of what I need to do with the cables in order to get them out of the way of the front, because again, we want to maximize airflow here. So first thing, this power switch, this is going to be what enables your power button to turn the PC on. There are gonna be these little ports where you've got 9 of them, or one of them is missing on the top left. The power switch is always gonna be below the one that's missing. So these cables here, I'm gonna plug that. You should normally have like a bunch of these. One is like a reset switch, one is LEDs, but again, this computer only has power on and off with no reset button, no LEDs, so you only have these 2 pins here. This is the front USB-C header. This is gonna plug in right here. And this is the front audio. This is a little bit annoying. I'm gonna try to route it down here, and the front audio, I believe, is back down this way. So before I go ahead and install my CPU cooler here, I'm gonna go ahead and install my power supply cables, the CPU cable, and the 24-pin cable. For a build like this, you're only gonna need these 4 cables here. This is your CPU cable, is gonna plug right into there. This is your PCI Express cable, and with the RTX 3090, you're gonna need 2 of these PCI Express cables here. I'm gonna put these aside because I'm not installing the graphics card just yet. And then this is the 24-pin motherboard cable. This is going to install right here. Right. I'm going to try to route this underneath here. And this is why I didn't install this part. I'm gonna try to route it underneath to hide that CPU cable so it's not like this. That'd be really ugly. I'll route it underneath here. Next, I'm gonna go ahead and install our PCI Express cable here. This is an extension, so I'm gonna remove this little plastic shroud right there. And I'm gonna go ahead and bend that up. And make sure this is peeled back. You see how it can pop in or out. So that's out, this is in. Make sure it's out. And then when you lower this in here, you're gonna see this pin pop back in by itself. Next is to install the all-in-one cooler. I'm gonna go ahead and swing both the tubes to the topmost portion and then lower that on just like this, just to make sure everything fits. Okay, looks like everything's okay. I'm gonna go ahead now and peel off this that covers that metal part. And I'm gonna go ahead and put my thermal grease on. Because the 12 series is like longer, I like, instead of putting a dot, because I feel like a dot doesn't cover the entire top and bottom, I like putting a line to make sure that it spreads everywhere. I think that'll do. Okay, drop that on there. Crap, I forgot. You need these screws, but I didn't open the bag yet, so I'm gonna cut. Oh, tear that out. When you tighten screws, you always want to go in a diagonal motion and don't over tighten. So diagonal, diagonal. This way you get even pressure on that motherboard. It's not straight, right? Yeah, it's definitely lopsided, and I don't know why. I guess it can't be helped, but that's gonna bother me. So next thing I'm gonna wanna do is hook up my fans. Most, I think if not all-in-one coolers come with a fan splitter. The fan splitter looks like this. And what it is there's one fan pin that goes into your motherboard, and however many fans, like in my case it's a 240, so there are 2 fans. These will plug into here. This way with this one cable, both fans, you can control both of them at the same speed with just one fan header. This one says CPU fan, so I'm gonna go ahead and put it right there. The reason why you want to find the right fan header is because a lot of motherboards won't boot if you don't have something in the CPU fan. You can override that, but if you don't know what you're doing, that could save you some headache by making sure you plug it into the CPU fan header. So now we're going to install the graphics card, but first you have to undo this cage over here. This is where your graphics card is going to pop out of. I'm not exactly sure which slots my graphics card is going to fill, so for the time being, I'm going to actually uninstall all 3 of these. Make sure that white slot is out, that's unlocking, just like we saw with the RAM. Put it up, route it up this way. So now I'm going to screw these back in. As you can see, I've got 2 slots handled. The third one, I actually don't think I'm going to be able to slot it back in, so I'll just keep it empty because this plastic shroud kind of gets in the way of that. At this point, I'm going to go ahead and install the RAM. So in order to install the RAM, you need to make sure that the clips in the back are open, just like we've seen in so many other places. And there are 2 slots here. They're not equal, so you need to make sure that when you measure them in, that there is a break in the RAM slots here. You need to make sure that they align. It looks kind of the same, or they look kind of equidistant, but they are not. The longer side, I believe, goes on the top side. And so what you're gonna do is once you're here, you're gonna go ahead and lower one side at a time. And you should hear a click. And again, one more time. I've got all of my cables here now, as well as my power supply cable here. I'm gonna go ahead and set up my power supply now. I've already installed it here, but basically you take those screws that I told you that come with your case, and you're gonna make sure that the fan is on the holy spot of this black piece, because this is gonna allow fresh air to get sucked in, and I'm gonna lower it just like this. So in order to do this, first I need to plug in, this is a power extension cable, I need to plug this into my power supply just like that. And make sure here, 0 is off, 1 is on. It will be set to 0 by default. Make sure you turn it on now because it's gonna be really hard for you to access it later. So make sure that's on. And make sure this power plug is in between your 2 pump cables or your pump tubes. And then I'm gonna make sure that all these cables are kind of out of the way. I'm gonna stick the cables underneath and out of the bottom slot so that I can go ahead and lower this in here without any intrusion. And then I'm gonna go ahead and lower all the cables through this hole and start connecting them to the bottom. Sorry, I forgot to do this earlier, but my graphics cards cables plugs are in now. These are PCI Express cables. You see PCIe here. The single piece will go into your power supply, and all the pieces with double, like it'll be a 3-piece and then a 1-piece, those will go into your graphics card. Because I have a 3090, I require actually 3 of them, so I have to use 2 of these PCIe cables because one of them had 2 and the third one had 1. A lot of power supplies are gonna have a single that leads to like 8 pins total, a single that leads to 8 pins total. So you might have an extra 4-pin just dangling off, not going anywhere, and that is totally okay. So I'll start with these because it's right here. I'm gonna go ahead, and this is CPU and PCI Express. So I'm gonna go ahead, I have a CPU cable here. So I'm gonna go ahead and plug this one right there, plug the second PCI Express cable right here. Then I've got my CPU cable. Now I've got my 24-pin motherboard cable, which is going to plug in. I know it's really hard to see here, guys. It's gonna plug in, the longer one is gonna plug in here, the shorter one will plug in there. There's no good way to show you guys this. Sorry about that. And that's it regarding my power cables. So again, I'll lower this down, shove all that excess cable underneath somehow. Let me screw this in and then I'll try to zip tie this bottom here. So let me go ahead and screw this in. This top part here, I'm still worried about all these cables clipping on the fan, so I'm still not gonna close it just yet. I'll turn it upside down and try to do something about these cables here. Honestly, there's not much that I can do. You probably just have to kind of ram them into this little empty slot as much as possible. And that's the best we can do here. Something you could do is you could buy custom length cables. They're gonna be a lot more expensive. It's gonna raise the cost of your build quite a bit, but that is a possibility. What I'm just gonna do is just shove it all down and screw this bottom piece back in. I mentioned this earlier, but I said that this might not have enough clearance, and I might be right about that. Let me go ahead and grab one of these panels and see if it'll go on. Actually, it's in, and there's a little bit of bulging, a little bit of flexing, so I don't think this is a perfect fit. Again, like I said earlier, I don't mind leaving this off. And last but not least, let's get this top sucker on. You know what would be really nice is if this was actually the front, so that I can leave this case off here, because looking at this is much more pleasant than the other side. So there it is. Now let's go power it on and see what happens. The PC has booted beautifully. Everything is reading just fine. I'm gonna go ahead and set the XMP profile on my RAM and run some benchmarks. But first, I wanna show you guys just how much smaller this thing is compared to my previous Dream PC build. It is night and day. Unfortunately, I'm not gonna do a ton of B-roll because my knee is jacked up. I can't really move that well, but enjoy some B-roll and then let's get to the benchmarks. At idle, my CPU sits at 46 degrees Celsius and my GPU sits around 43 degrees Celsius. In all of my testing, the GPU never exceeded 75 degrees Celsius, which is pretty amazing. I only did synthetic benchmarks because I don't plan to game on this PC, so for Time Spy, I got a total score of 19,631 with a graphics score of 19,522 and the CPU score of 20,275. The CPU did hit a maximum of 89 degrees Celsius, but I didn't see any throttling. In Time Spy Extreme, which is for 4K gaming, which is what this PC would be doing, the score overall is 9,722 with a graphics score of 10,035 and a CPU score of 8,266. The CPU hit a maximum temperature of 86 degrees Celsius. In the CPU profile benchmark, here are my scores, and my CPU hit a maximum of 83 degrees Celsius. In Puget Bench for Premiere Pro, I scored 1,487, which is absolutely nuts. Like, this thing beat out computers with 32 cores. There was a maximum temperature on the CPU of 99 degrees Celsius, but the average here was only 50 degrees Celsius. The CPU did throttle in this test. And finally, the question on many minds is, can 750 watts power this beast? And the answer is yes. The maximum power draw on the CPU was 248 watts, and the maximum power draw on the graphics card was 390 watts. That's gonna do it for this one. If you have any questions, leave them down below. I'll do my best to answer them. Until next time, stay safe, and as always, stay honest.